welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am here with the author of a book that has swallowed my life. I am really obsessed with it. It is such a fantastic read. I have so many questions about the history, the characters, so many things. I'm so excited. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. Welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hey, Jen, thank you for having me. My name is Rebecca Lehmann, and I am the author of the novel The Beheading Game, which is kind of like a speculative magical realism historical fiction novel about Anne Boleyn. And the basic premise of the novel is Anne Boleyn wakes up after her own execution. She's still alive, but she's beheaded, and she escapes from the Tower of London, sews her head back on, and goes on a revenge quest to kill Henry VIII before he can marry his next wife, Jane Seymour, who in real life he married just 11 days after Anne's execution.
It is galling, really, when you when you think about
It
it
is. It
briefly.
is. When I started to dive into writing about the novel and thinking, and when I was just dipping a toe in Anne Boleyn lore and trying to decide if I was going to write her as like innocent or guilty, and then I started looking at the facts of the case, I thought she so obviously was not guilty of these things. And then he remarries 11 days later seems like a big piece of evidence that maybe he had ulterior motives.
Yeah.
If you have your next wife waiting in the wings.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It really, before I get to my real questions, it did just occur to me that like, wow, if there had been Twitter in this world or Blue Sky, like none of this would have had, like Henry be so canceled, like, and rightly so.
Yeah. Maybe. I hope so.
I
But then
hope
again, maybe not. I
that's
mean,
true. Maybe like 2 years ago, I might have said, but let's, who knows?
yeah, wait, we can hope. We can
Yeah.
hope. But yeah, he's a pretty appalling figure when you die from a contemporary lens. But I think even in his day, people were really shocked by what he was doing.
Absolutely. So before we get too much into the book, too much more into it, I'd love if you could start by telling us a little bit about your writing journey and some of the other things that you've written.
Yeah, well, so I'm also a poet, and I was a poet for like 20 years before I wrote this novel. And like by 20 years, I mean going back to when I was, 20 years old and just calling myself a poet. But I studied poetry. I got multiple degrees in poetry, did an MFA in poetry. I've published 3 books of poetry, and I am a professor of poetry. So my life has been really poetry heavy. But I always had thought in the back of my mind one day I will write a novel. And I think for me, when I turned 40 and kind of like had this midlife moment, I thought, okay, I've been threatening to do this for so long. There's never going to be a perfect time. And I have this idea that I'm really passionate about. So I'm just going to dive in and do it. And I thought, like, I really wanted to retell the story of Anne Boleyn because I thought that she had always been represented in a really like two-dimensional way every time I would encounter her, like often as this sort of seductress who like prized Henry out of his first marriage and prized England out of the Catholic Church, but just because she wants to marry Henry VIII for no other like political or theological reasons. And then that she gets what she deserves when she's beheaded. That's kind of often how that story is told. And it doesn't take much research at all to realize that she was actually a very complicated person, very intelligent, that she had deep theological beliefs. She was like a true believer in the Protestant Reformation, big political aims and goals as that she wanted to enact as Queen of England, and that she was most likely innocent of all the charges that were laid against her, which most historians today agree is likely true.
The book does a really great job of neither obviously condemning or villainizing her, or on the flip side, overly valorizing or idealizing her. She's very much still a woman of her time. And you do a great job of exploring the way that there are so many factors that cut through the way that women relate to each other, whether it's class or upbringing or all these other things. This was of particular interest to me because before I was a librarian, I was a medieval historian and I studied
Ooh,
women's interactions across like class and religious lines and all of these things. And just the way that you depict Anne as, capable of sort of viewing what she had in common with other women from other walks of life, yet still very much informed by her like privilege and her upbringing and perhaps not capable of connecting immediately. So yeah, what sort of research went into bringing the time alive and particularly like the forces that would have shaped different women's lives?
yeah, thanks. I'm so excited that you were a medieval scholar. That's great. I love that area. It's so fascinating. I did a lot of research for the novel. I read a lot of historical books and historical texts by contemporary scholars and biographies of Anne Boleyn. And then I also tried to read books that dove into just kind of like general Tudor history because I wanted to get the experiences of everyday people into the novel. And I think that a lot of times when we go to historical fiction and to particularly fiction about the Tudors, it's like such a hyperfixation on the Tudors themselves. They're so fascinating. This novel is no exception. It is mostly about Anne Boleyn, but also there were a lot of other people living during that time period. And sometimes, especially if you're not someone who has studied that period of history very well, like you get this perception that the peasants were just like, okay, let's like, yeah, this sounds great. But in fact, there were like peasant revolts all the time, and people were not just like, this is great. We love being at the bottom of this ladder. And so I really wanted to bring that side of the Tudor world to life. And there is a character in the novel named Alice who shows up in the first section of the book and becomes like a friend and ally for Anne. And then later on in the novel, a little bit of a romantic interest. And she becomes the kind of mouthpiece for that everyday person's Tudor experience. And I had a lot of fun writing her because I am not myself from any kind of royal background or privileged background. And so I felt like that was a character that was very easy to slip into and kind of think about like, what would you think if you were a common person in Tudor England and you encountered somebody from the noble class who had a bit of an attitude. But I also thought about how like Anne Boleyn was somebody who did have these ambitions. Like, for example, when the monasteries were dissolved in England, she wanted the proceeds from the dissolution of the monasteries to go to like hospitals and colleges and schools and things that she imagined benefiting the common people. But she also like never went and met the common people and asked them what they wanted. And she had a very highfalutin attitude and was known to say kind of like disparaging things to servants and workers that she interacted with and remind them of her station very quickly. And I think that that's a kind of double think that you still see in political leaders today, where like they imagine they know what's best for the masses, but they are very separate and perhaps not like doing the outreach that they need to do to get there and see it. And I wanted to show Anne as like a complete person in this book too, right? Like she, I think, was treated really poorly in her time and has been treated in a really two-dimensional way by history for the most part. But I didn't want to just like take the devil horns off of her and put a halo on. I wanted to give that three-dimensional picture of her as a complex person because she was.
And then on top of this all, the speculative element, this sort of miraculous resurrection that
Yeah.
allows her to pursue a number of things. What was the inception point for that? It is such a great concept, and I'm just like where like if I ever had an idea that good, I'd just be like, you know, check that off my list. Like
Yeah, thank you. I was really worried it was going to be too weird that she comes back to life and scissor her back on. But you know, like when I knew I wanted to retell her story, and I was really trying to think about how best to do it. And I thought, like, okay, I could write a retelling where like she escapes first, or I also had an idea at one point, like, what if she married James Butler, her Irish cousin, and like just moved to Ireland instead? Or what if I recast the story in contemporary times and she has more power and can get out of the marriage? But I think the thing that makes Anne's story really compelling is that she was beheaded. And it's like the crystallization of the misogyny of her time period and of like misogyny that still echoes today, where powerful women are sometimes punished for their power and for their success. And that's what makes the story like relatable across 500 years of history. So I wanted to keep that in. And then I thought, okay, well, what if she just comes back to life? Like what if she just can pick her head back up? And I was basing that off of other stories where characters come back to life after they are beheaded. And there's a whole class of stories called cephalophore stories, which you probably know all about because a bunch of them are like medieval saint stories. But there's also Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a well-known Arthurian legend where the Green Knight Gawain beheads the Green Knight, and then the Green Knight turns out is magical and can carry his head off and just continue on with his life, or the Headless Horseman in American folklore and storytelling traditions. So like the idea of somebody that gets beheaded and just kind of like keeps going. And I thought, well, that could be her. Like what if she could just keep going with her head and live. And then I very quickly, once I started writing the novel, realized that she needed to sew her head back on because she would stand out terribly if she's just carrying it around. So she does get it back on her head and continue forward there. But I was nervous when I was writing it because I wanted to write a novel that treated her seriously and like dove into her story in a serious way. But I also wanted this kind of like fantastical element to enter and have this magical realism element.
Yeah, I never really actually thought about stories about headless people carrying on as a genre, but that is absolutely, or a trope, that is absolutely fascinating. And they do run quite a gamut, even just in those
Yeah.
you mentioned, because you have a figure of horror like the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and saints on the other hand, whose
Yes.
beheadings found churches and cities and all sorts of interesting things. Yeah, it's such a great conceit, and it's like realism balanced with a really fun sort of like escapism that I think is inherent in like most revenge plots, because even if we aren't all people who want like, violent retribution for something, I think we've all wanted justice or fairness or some sort of
Hmm.
comeuppance for somebody. So yeah, it's a whole lot of fun, and it's a high wire act that you pull off really well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad it worked.
Yeah.
And it was very fun to write. And it was really fun to write the sections when she had her head off too, because it's like thinking through, okay, everything she sees, she's going to have to be holding her head and turning it in different directions and like turning it up and turning it down. And I got very nervous. Like she leaves the Tower of London with her head under her arms and steals the jailer's boat and uses it to cross the Thames. And I like I'm the person writing the book, so I was in total control, but I got nervous as I was writing it that she was going to drop her head in the water, and I could feel myself getting anxious, although I was in total control of the situation as the author. But yeah.
Yeah, I was really scared about that too at that point. Because heads are very heavy, I imagine, for the
Yes,
neck
right. And
problems.
once it goes down, like, are you ever going to find it again?
Yeah. Wow. So, I have a question too about the Henry of it all, depicting a larger than life figure who, you know, even though he was, I think, absolutely one of history's villains in many ways, was still
Hmm.
like a figure who, when depicted in the sources of his time, like were usually depicted with some sorts of motivations or agendas and things like that. So what was your approach to depicting this figure who's been depicted so much in media and such a charged figure too?
Yeah, I know, right? Because he's been written about so much. And
Mm.
I think, when you view him from a contemporary perspective in particular, he just looks like such an obvious monster. Like he
Mm.
has six wives, he chews through them. He like very often disposes of people as soon as he's done with them. So even people that he's not married to, like Thomas More or Cardinal Wolsey, or maybe most famously Thomas Cromwell, end up meeting very bad ends. More and Cromwell are executed. Wolsey dies after being imprisoned by Henry VIII once he's finished with him. So he's like this terrible person who's just as soon as somebody has outlived their purpose, he's like, I'm done with you. And because he's king, he has absolute power. And then when England separates from the Catholic Church, he acquires even more power. And so I really thought about first of all, what would it be like to have power over an entire nation and to be the king and to have everybody just bend to your will? And then what would it be like to accumulate more power on top of that? And I think that that was something that I really wanted to explore via Anne's perception of him, because she is really instrumental in giving him that extra power, because she is such an advocate of the Protestant Reformation, and she's giving him these texts like William Tyndale's Obedience of a Christian Man and English language Bibles, that she's like pointing out passages for him to read, even almost like a school marm, like, here, read this, that he then uses to make these arguments for acquiring more power, which in the end is part of her undoing, because he has so much power by the time her brief reign ends. He's acquired just this massive amount of power. But I also wanted to think about like their relationship and the ways that power can be really attractive sometimes. Like, I didn't want to just write this as he's a terrible monster and why couldn't she see it. I wanted to go back and show memories of times that they were together when he is loving, and a lot of that is imagined, but when he is seductive, or when you can see as a reader, like, here's what somebody would like about this man. I think as Henry VIII, like outside of this novel, as Henry VIII got older, he got grosser and less potentially attractive. Like, he had a big festering leg wound that he gets when he's married to Anne Boleyn that never completely heals, that people said you could smell a room away from wherever he was. It was that fecund. Yeah, very gross. And he got very portly as he aged, and he kept marrying like younger and younger women. So I imagine there was like not a lot there to be attracted to. But I think when Anne met him, he was still a youngish man in his 30s, and very like tall and athletic and smart and charismatic. And I wanted to get that in there, that like she's had these moments with this man where he did truly seem to love her and see her and be interested in her intelligence and want to co-lead England with her, for example. But then he just turns like that. Like, he can't be trusted. He has so much power that you just can't trust him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so you know, tempting yet ultimately not useful to like try to diagnose people from history, with various
Totally.
disorders or personality disorders or what have you. But there is something to be said how even just, with politicians, most politicians, when they turn their attention on you, they can make you feel like the center of the world,
Mm.
and there's something about that sort of like weaponized charm that somebody like a young Henry is capable of. And combining that with this like very utilitarian view of people, yeah, is just like it is probably a hard trap to avoid and
Yeah.
and very dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's been like raised to be this for his whole life. Like, he wasn't the intended heir to the throne of England. His older brother was supposed to be the king and then died of a fever. So Henry inherits the throne. But even though he's like second in line, so he's been getting this like training his whole life, like, you're the most important person in the world. What you say goes. That's got to be very hard to resist as a person if you've been raised with this attitude that you're like ordained by God to rule everyone around you, and you really believe that that's true. Like you said, you can like retroactively try to armchair diagnose somebody with a disorder, but I think that in and of itself would make anybody behave in ways that we might look at now and think like, oh my God, that's awful.
Yeah, because it's not even like really delusional. Like he had so much power that
Right.
reality did bend to him. So
Yeah, it's an accurate perception of the world
yes.
around him, though he could have like used the power for good.
Yeah.
But then like maybe in some ways he did. I think people that were in favor of the Protestant Reformation are like, you know what, the ends justify the means, or however the saying goes, the means justify the ends, and so we're good. But yeah, more complicated than that probably.
Absolutely. Yeah, this book was just such a wild ride and it was so much fun to read. And it's, yeah, the realism with the sort of really well pulled off speculative elements, just so much fun.
Thank
Um,
you.
what is next for you? I know that like you're probably busy with the lead up to this publication right now, but are you writing at the moment? Do you see more novels in your future?
I do. Yeah, I loved writing this novel. It was so much fun. And, like the research for it was fun. I went to England and did like a tutor tour, self-directed tutor tour of London. All of that was just such a blast. And I really enjoyed diving into a longer form of writing. So yeah, there's definitely more fiction in my future. I've just finished the first draft of a second novel, but it's still like very new. So we're not ready to really talk about that in a more public way yet, but I feel like I've caught the bug now.
Oh, great. That's excellent to hear because I can't wait to read what's next. So happy editing and
Yeah.
revising.
Yeah, I know everyone has different feelings about the writing process, but like many writers, I really enjoy writing, but editing is a whole different beast. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time and for sharing your book with us. And listeners, thank you for joining us. Please check out the Beheading Game. It is just so much fun. Oh, I just, yeah, I could read it again right now. It's just such a good read. It's going to be one of my favorites of the year, even though it's a young year. Thank you for joining us. You can get the book as the time that you are hearing this at your favorite bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go. All right, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.